About 2 years ago, I had one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. I was driving home from a family reunion late at night around 10 p.m. after spending a wonderful, laughter-filled evening with relatives. The reunion had been held in a small rural town, tucked away in the countryside, and my drive home would take about 2 hours. I had considered staying the night, but I had work early the next morning and didn't want to risk being late. So, I hit the road, despite the creeping exhaustion that was starting to settle in. The route home was mostly composed of narrow, winding roads flanked by towering trees and dense bushes. It was the kind of setting that would give anyone a little shiver, a dark, isolated path where your headlights could barely pierce the thick shadows beyond the tree line. The kind of road you might see in a thriller movie, where something ominous always seems to be lurking just out of sight. But I tried to push those thoughts aside and focus on the drive. About 45 minutes into the journey, something hit me hard. Fatigue. You know how sometimes it sneaks up on you, and all of a sudden, your eyelids feel like they weigh a ton? That's exactly what happened. I was overcome with this overwhelming urge to sleep, almost like I could feel myself starting to nod off. At first, I tried to fight it, rolling down the windows to let the cool night air in, turning up the radio. Anything to keep myself alert, but it was clear. I wasn't going to make it the rest of the way without stopping to rest. I kept my eyes peeled for a safe place to pull over, a rest stop, or a gas station, but I wasn't having any luck. It was nothing but endless trees and dark road. Every few minutes, another car would pass by, but the stretch of road felt almost unnervingly deserted. I knew stopping right there on the side of the road wasn't the best idea, but I also knew I couldn't keep driving much longer without risking an accident. That's when I made a decision that, looking back, was questionable at best. I spotted a small clearing just off the road, hidden behind a cluster of bushes. It wasn't ideal, but it felt secluded enough that I could stop for a bit without drawing too much attention. I pulled over, carefully driving my car onto the grass and parking behind the bushes so that my vehicle wasn't visible from the road. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 11:22 p.m. I leaned my seat back, closed my eyes, and let myself drift off. I don't know how long I slept, but the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a strange noise, a faint scratching sound. I opened my eyes, feeling groggy and disoriented, and checked the time. It was 11:50 p.m., just under 30 minutes had passed. The noise stopped almost as quickly as it had started, and my sleep-deprived brain brushed it off as a small animal, or maybe even branches brushing against the car. Too tired to really think much of it, I shrugged it off and went back to sleep. But I wouldn't stay asleep for long. I woke up again, this time to the same scratching noise, only now it was louder, more persistent. My heart rate picked up as I glanced at the clock, 12:40 a.m. This time the sound wasn't going away. It was as if something or someone was deliberately making that noise. I sat up straight, my pulse quickening as a wave of unease washed over me. I tried to rationalize it, thinking it might just be a curious animal, but why would it return almost an hour after the first time? Something didn't feel right. I cautiously glanced into my rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. Just a glimpse, but enough to send a chill down my spine. Something was moving in the shadows, darting back into the trees as soon as my eyes caught it. I couldn't make out what it was exactly, but it definitely wasn't an animal. It was the shape of a person, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. At that moment, a terrifying thought flashed through my mind. I recalled one of those old urban legends, the one about the hook-handed killer who scratched at a couple's car before attacking them. I tried to shake off the idea. It was just an old story, right? But my instincts were screaming at me to get out of there. I wasn't about to stick around and find out who or what was lurking in the woods. I turned the key in the ignition, my heart pounding in my chest, and quickly pulled back onto the road. I didn't care how tired I was anymore. Adrenaline had taken over, and I just wanted to put as much distance between me and that spot as possible. My headlights lit up the road ahead, and as I rounded a bend no more than 100 yards up, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a car parked on the side of the road, just like mine had been. Its driver's side door was wide open, but there was no one inside. I slowed down, my curiosity getting the better of me, and glanced over at the empty car. For a brief moment, everything was eerily still. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement in my rearview mirror. A man. He came sprinting around the bend from where I had just been. He was running toward my car, shouting something. My pulse quickened as I tried to make out what he was saying. Hey you, stop, get out of the car. His voice grew louder and more frantic as he got closer. Get out of your car, now. Panic surged through me. I didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but nothing about the situation felt right. Every instinct I had screamed at me to leave, so I floored the gas pedal and sped off, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, heart racing and hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I never saw the man again, and I have no idea what his intentions were. Maybe he needed help, or maybe it was something far more sinister. But one thing I do know, I'll never pull over to sleep on the side of a deserted road again. It was a late fall evening, the kind where the moon barely peeks through a veil of low-hanging clouds, casting an eerie, dim glow on everything beneath it. My mom, my daughter, my infant grandson and I were driving through the country. We had just left the Augusta, Georgia area and were headed toward Savannah, taking a familiar route we'd driven countless times before. It's about a 2-hour drive, and we were somewhere between Waynesboro and Millen, driving down a divided 4-lane highway. Out there, the highway is surrounded by nothing but vast empty fields and dark stretches of thick woods that loom over the road like silent, watchful giants. I was driving my new car, which had automatic high and low beams and adaptive cruise control, both of which I was relying on as we cut through the darkness. With my family in the car, especially with my baby grandson in the back seat, I was driving cautiously. My hands gripped the wheel tighter than usual, and I kept my eyes peeled on the road ahead, fully alert for anything unusual. I was in the left lane, keeping a steady pace, when something strange began to happen. At first, it was just a feeling, a twinge of unease that crept up my spine, the kind of instinctive awareness that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. The road had been mostly empty, just the faint hum of the tires on the pavement, the occasional swoosh of wind rustling the trees at the edge of the highway. And then, out of nowhere, something appeared in the right lane. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, that maybe I was tired, or the shadows from the trees were shifting in some odd way. But no, this was different. It was quick, barely a few car lengths ahead of us, but I saw it, something materializing right there in the right lane, as if it had been waiting, lurking in the darkness, and decided to reveal itself in that exact moment. It was too big to be a dog, but too small to be a deer. Whatever it was, it didn't move like any animal I'd ever seen. Its body seemed translucent. I could see through it, but there was a strange solidity around its spine, like a ghost with just a touch of substance to it. The figure had a dull grayish hue, and its form flickered, almost as if it was phasing in and out of existence. It didn't move like a creature of this world. No hesitation, no slow start. It simply ran, straight toward the edge of the road with an impossible speed, disappearing into the brush as quickly as it had appeared. I was stunned. My mind was trying desperately to make sense of what I had just seen. There was no time for me to react. There was no swerving, no braking. There was no need for that. The thing hadn't crossed in front of us. It had appeared directly on the road, right in our path. And just as quickly as it had come, it was gone. I stared at the spot where it had been, my heart pounding in my chest. My breathing was shallow, and the road felt darker now, heavier. A creeping sense of dread washed over me, and I couldn't shake it. Before I could say anything, my daughter's voice cut through the silence, sharp and filled with confusion. What was that? I turned to her, thankful that I wasn't alone in this, that someone else had seen it too. I swallowed, my mouth dry, and asked her to describe what she had seen, hoping, praying, that I wasn't losing my mind. She described it exactly as I had seen it. The same strange figure, the The same quick materialization, the same impossible speed as it darted off into the brush. It hadn't crossed in front of the car, hadn't followed any natural movements of an animal. It had just appeared. I kept replaying it in my mind. There's no way it could have been there before. It didn't run across the road from the other side. It had simply materialized, as if it stepped through some invisible door, appearing out of thin air. And the way it moved, so fast, so sudden, it made my heart race just thinking about it. My car, with all its advanced features, would have reacted if something had crossed in front of us. The cruise control would have slowed us down, the automatic beams would have highlighted it, but none of that happened. The figure was there, and then it was gone. For a while, neither of us said anything. My mom, in the back with my grandson, hadn't seen it. She was preoccupied with the baby, thankfully. But the air in the car was thick with tension, like we had just stepped into something we weren't supposed to witness. The rest of the drive felt off. Every shadow that crossed the road seemed sinister. Every rustle of leaves on the side of the highway sent chills down my spine. My daughter kept glancing out the window, and I found myself scanning the road ahead and behind, waiting, almost expecting, to see something else. But nothing more appeared, at least, not visibly. As we finally neared civilization, the streetlights returning and the trees thinning out, that oppressive feeling began to lift. But the encounter stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. Later that night, after we reached our destination, I did some searching, desperate to find some logical explanation. An animal native to the area, maybe, or some optical illusion caused by the car's lights. But nothing added up. No creature fit the description, and no natural phenomenon explained the way it had simply materialized and vanished. And then I came across something that made my skin crawl. Stories from other people who had traveled that same stretch of highway. Accounts of shadowy figures appearing out of nowhere. Strange, translucent beings that dart across the road only to disappear before anyone can get a closer look. They were always described the same way: ghostly, fast, and unsettlingly real. I'm not saying I know what we saw that night, but after reading those stories, I couldn't help but wonder, was it something more than just an animal? Was it something interdimensional? Something that wasn't supposed to be in our world, but somehow crossed over for just a moment? Whatever it was, it left a mark on me, a feeling that I can't quite shake. It made me realize there's more out there, more than we can see, more than we can explain. And whatever it is, it's watching. I've always loved road trips. There's something peaceful about being out on the open road, just you, the hum of the engine, and the long stretch of highway ahead. For as long as I can remember, it's been my escape. I get restless sitting at home, so when I get a chance to hit the road, I take it without hesitation. This particular trip was supposed to be a solo drive from Boise to Portland. I had some vacation time saved up, and I figured I'd visit an old college friend who moved out to the city a couple of years ago. The plan was to leave on a Friday afternoon, stay in Portland for the weekend, and drive back by Sunday evening. Simple. No drama, just miles of road between me and some time off. I left around 4 p.m., hoping to beat the rush hour traffic and get through most of the trip while it was still light out. I had music on, snacks in the passenger seat, and a large coffee in the cup holder. Everything was going great until I hit some unexpected construction about 2 hours into the drive. There was a sign telling me that the highway would be closed for the next 20 miles. A long line of cars was piling up ahead, all funneled into a single lane, crawling at a snail's pace. I could already feel the anxiety bubbling up. Sitting still in traffic was the exact opposite of why I loved road trips. Then, I remembered seeing a turnoff about a mile back that led onto an old country road. If I took it, I could bypass this mess and rejoin the highway later. It wasn't exactly on the map, but it looked like a shortcut that might save me time, or at least my sanity. I made a quick decision and took the exit. The narrow 2-lane road wound through a forested area, and almost immediately, I felt better. No cars in sight. Just me and the open road again. I figured it might add 20 or 30 minutes to the trip, but I was okay with that. For a while, everything was fine. The scenery was beautiful. Tall pine trees lining either side of the road, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple as the sun began to set. I even turned the music down to enjoy the stillness of the moment. But as I kept driving, the road got more isolated. The trees seemed thicker, the shadows longer, and the light from the setting sun was quickly fading. I hadn't seen another car for at least an hour, but that didn't bother me too much. I've always enjoyed the solitude. What did bother me, though, was my GPS. The signal had cut out about 20 minutes after I turned onto this road, and I had no idea how long I'd be driving before rejoining the highway. No big deal, I told myself. I'd find my way eventually. After all, the road could only lead in one direction, right? Then, about an hour in, I saw something strange. It was a little house tucked back off the road, almost hidden behind the trees. I wouldn't have noticed it if it weren't for the dim porch light glowing faintly in the growing darkness. The house looked old, run down even. The wood was weathered and chipped, the windows dark. Something about it made my skin crawl, but I couldn't pinpoint why. I tried to shake the feeling, but as I passed it, I noticed a figure standing near the edge of the trees by the house. It was too dark to see clearly, but I could make out the shape of a person, a man, I think, just standing there, watching as I drove by. I felt my chest tighten and instinctively pressed down on the gas pedal a little harder. It was probably nothing, someone just standing by their house, right? But there was something off about how still he stood, how he seemed to be watching me without moving. I kept driving, pushing the unsettling image to the back of my mind. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my stomach. After a few more miles, the road began to narrow even more, and the trees closed in, their branches arching over the road like a canopy. The light was almost completely gone now, and I had to turn on my high beams just to see a few feet ahead. That's when I saw it again. Another house, just like the first one. Same weathered wood, same dark windows, same dim light glowing faintly on the porch. And again, standing at the edge of the trees, was a figure. This time, I could see him more clearly. He was tall, wearing a long coat, and standing unnaturally still. I sped past, heart pounding in my chest, my eyes glued to the road ahead. How could there be two houses that looked exactly the same with two figures standing in the same spot? I don't scare easily, but I'll admit that at this point I was starting to get freaked out. The road seemed to go on forever, and I still hadn't seen any signs of life. No cars, no streetlights, nothing. Just those two houses. After a few more miles, I saw something in the distance. My heart lifted for a second. I thought it might be a sign or a gas station, anything that would tell me I was getting closer to civilization. But as I got closer, my stomach dropped. It was the same house, the same porch light, the same dark windows, the same figure standing at the edge of the trees. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt in the middle of the road. I couldn't believe it. There was no way. I hadn't turned around. I'd been driving straight this entire time, but here it was again. The same house. I felt my hands start to shake as I gripped the steering wheel. This couldn't be happening. I must have made a wrong turn somewhere, right? Maybe I had gotten turned around without realizing it. I fumbled with my phone, praying that my GPS would kick back in, but there was still no signal. For a long moment, I just sat there staring at the house. The figure hadn't moved. He was just standing there watching me. I don't know how long I stayed like that, frozen in place, before I finally snapped out of it. I needed to get out of here. Now I pressed my foot on the gas and sped down the road, faster than I should have been going. The trees blurred past on either side, and my heart was racing. I just wanted to get back to the highway, back to somewhere familiar. But no matter how far I drove, the road never seemed to end. And then, just as the panic started to set in, I saw it again. The same house, the same porch light, the same figure. It was like I was stuck in some kind of loop, driving in circles without realizing it. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't turn around. I didn't even know where I would go if I did. In a desperate attempt to break the cycle, I pulled over on the side of the road. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely put the car in park. I turned off the engine, sitting in the suffocating silence, trying to catch my breath. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for. Maybe for someone to come by or for the sun to rise. Anything to make this stop. But instead, I heard something else. A rustling sound like leaves crunching underfoot. It was coming from the trees. Slowly, I turned my head toward the noise. The figure was gone from the edge of the trees. And then, I heard footsteps. They were getting closer. My breath caught in my throat. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like whoever or whatever was out there wasn't in any kind of rush. The sound of the leaves crunching underfoot was the only thing I could focus on, each step closer making my pulse race even harder. I thought about turning the car back on, but some part of me, some deep instinct, told me not to move, not to make a sound. I don't know why I didn't just peel out of there. Maybe it was fear paralyzing me, or maybe I was trying to convince myself that if I stayed still, it would go away. But I could hear it now. Not just the footsteps, the breathing. Deep, raspy breaths coming from just beyond the line of trees. My fingers were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were turning white. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears, my mouth dry. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out of there, but I couldn't move. I just stared out at the darkness, trying to see something, anything. And then, in the faint glow of my headlights, I saw it. A figure stepped out from the trees. It was the same man I'd seen standing by the house, or at least it looked like him. He was tall, gaunt, his face shadowed under the brim of a wide, worn-out hat. His long coat hung off him like it was too big for his frame, and the way he moved, it wasn't right. It was like he was gliding, his feet barely lifting off the ground as he came closer to my car. He didn't seem in a hurry. He just moved slowly toward the passenger side of my car, the shadows swallowing most of his face. I couldn't make out his features, but I could see his eyes reflecting in the light, pale, almost too bright in the darkness. I tried to tell myself he was just a guy. Maybe he was a local, someone who lived in one of those houses and was curious about why I'd pulled over. But there was something wrong about him. Something that made every hair on my body stand on end. He stopped about 10 feet from the car, just standing there, staring. His head tilted slightly like he was studying me, waiting to see what I'd do. My mind raced with what could happen next. Was he going to try to talk to me? Was he going to knock on the window? Or worse, was he going to try to get inside? I couldn't take it anymore. My hand fumbled for the keys, turning them in the ignition with a frantic twist. The engine sputtered for a moment, just long enough for my stomach to drop, before roaring to life. I shifted into gear, and before I even had a chance to think about it, I slammed my foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, tires squealing on the pavement as I sped down the road, my heart pounding in my chest. In the rearview mirror, I saw the figure still standing there, not moving, just watching as I drove away. I kept driving. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to put as much distance between me and that thing as possible. The road wound through the dense trees, and I pushed the car faster than I should have. Every bend in the road felt like it was leading me further into some endless nightmare. I checked the rearview mirror again. Nothing. No figure. No headlights from another car. I was completely alone. After what felt like an eternity, the trees started to thin, and I finally saw a sign ahead, a small, rusted highway marker. I didn't care where it pointed. I just wanted to get back on a main road, back to somewhere familiar. I took the turn without hesitation, praying that this time I wouldn't end up in the same place. The road widened, and the trees gave way to more open land. I saw the distant glow of lights ahead, streetlights, a gas station, something. The relief was so overwhelming that I almost cried. I didn't care how long I'd been driving, didn't care about the time I'd lost. All I wanted was to get out of there. I pulled into the gas station, my hands still shaking as I parked the car. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I stepped out, my legs feeling like jelly. I stumbled inside, the stale smell of coffee and cheap snacks hitting me as soon as I walked through the door. The attendant behind the counter glanced up at me, giving me a look that told me I must have looked as bad as I felt. I mustered the strength to ask where the nearest town was, and he told me I was about 40 miles outside of Portland. I'd somehow made it back on track without even realizing it. I thanked him, grabbed a water from the cooler, and headed back to the car. As I sat there, the engine still running, I let out a long, shaky breath. I was safe. Whatever had happened back there, whatever I had seen, I was out of it now. I could explain it away later. Fatigue, stress, maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But then I looked down at the passenger seat. There, resting on the seat where my bag had been, was a single scrap of paper. I don't know how it got there, but when I picked it up, my blood ran cold. In shaky, jagged handwriting, the words were scrawled across the paper. "See you soon." I dropped the paper and looked around frantically, but there was no one in sight. The parking lot was empty, the gas station quiet except for the hum of the lights overhead. I grabbed the paper again, crumpling it in my fist as I threw it on the floor of the car. Without a second thought, I hit the gas, tearing out of the parking lot and heading straight for the highway. I didn't stop again until I reached my friend's house in Portland. By the time I got there, it was well after midnight, and I was so exhausted I could barely explain what had happened. I left out the weird parts, of course. I told him I got lost, ended up on some back road. I didn't mention the houses, the figure, or the note. I stayed in Portland for the weekend just like I had planned, but I never really shook that feeling. I kept waiting for something to happen, for someone to show up. But nothing did. It's been a year now, and I still think about it. Every time I get in my car for a long drive, I find myself glancing at the passenger seat, half expecting to see another note. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving alone down a quiet stretch of road, I catch a glimpse of something in my rear-view mirror. A figure standing at the edge of the trees watching, and I wonder if someday I'll see him again, or if he's already found me. It was a perfect summer day in northern Wisconsin, the kind of day where the sky is clear and the sun warms everything just right. My family and I were in the car, driving between small towns, the kind of distance where it takes about 20 minutes to get from one place to the next. The plan was simple: head to the blueberry fields and spend a quiet afternoon picking berries. The stretch of road we were on cut through wide open fields, scattered farms, and patches of dense forest. It was quiet country, the kind of place where the world feels far away. As we cruised along a particularly open stretch of road, I spotted something up ahead. At first it seemed ordinary, but then again, out here, anything out of place catches your attention. It was an old man, walking along the side of the road. He looked like he had stepped straight out of a postcard. Blue jean overalls, a faded cap, worn boots. The classic old farmer, like something out of a storybook. One of us, maybe my sister, I can't quite remember, commented as we passed him. "Oh, look, an old man out for a walk." We all glanced at him as we drove by, his slow pace suggesting he was in no hurry, just enjoying the sunny day. But there was something a little off. I couldn't put my finger on it at the time, but his walk felt strangely out of place, almost too slow, like he was in a world of his own. We continued down the road, reaching an intersection about a minute later. I made the turn without really thinking, chatting with my family, distracted by the casual flow of conversation. But a few moments after, we realized we'd taken the wrong turn. No big deal. We'd only gone a little out of the way, so I swung the car around and we headed back. It couldn't have been more than 5 minutes, maybe less, since we'd passed the old man. As we neared the intersection again, I half expected to see him up ahead continuing his slow stroll. But he wasn't there. The road stretched out in front of us, empty. That didn't make sense. There were no trees or buildings he could have disappeared behind, just flat, open fields as far as the eye could see. He couldn't have gone far on foot, not in the time it took us to turn around. We slowed down, scanning the fields on either side. There was nowhere for him to hide, nowhere he could have gone. The road was eerily quiet now, the sun still beaming down, but the warmth seemed to have faded from the day. "I think we should check the ditches," someone in the car said. "Maybe he fell or something." The idea chilled me. The thought of the old man lying out there hurt or worse didn't sit right. So, we pulled over and got out. We walked along the roadside, peering into the shallow ditches that ran alongside the road. Nothing. No sign of him. Not a footprint. Not a rustle of disturbed grass. The fields stretched out like a sea of emptiness, with no place for someone to vanish. We searched for several minutes, calling out just in case he needed help, but it was as if he had simply disappeared. We got back in the car, and for a long moment no one said anything. The silence was heavy, pressing down on us, the kind of silence that makes you second-guess what you've seen. We should have been able to spot him from a mile away. There was nothing out here but flat land and distant farms. And yet, the old man was simply gone. It was then that we all exchanged glances, the realization settling in. We hadn't just seen some random farmer taking a walk on a sunny day. We had seen something else. Something we couldn't explain. "You think—" my sister started, but her voice trailed off. "Yeah," I said quietly, my mind trying to process what felt impossible. We'd all seen him. We'd all noticed him. But none of us could explain how he could vanish like that, without a trace. Looking back now, I can't say for sure what we encountered that day, but it didn't feel threatening, just strange. It was as if we'd caught a glimpse of something, or someone, that didn't quite belong to our time. A ghost, maybe. An apparition of an old farmer who'd spent his days walking that very road, long after his time had passed. Whatever it was, I'll never forget the sight of him, slowly walking under the summer sun, and the unsettling feeling of knowing we saw something that wasn't meant to be seen. They say the open road has its share of ghosts, but I never put much stock in those tales, until one night changed everything. It was late October, and I was hauling a load of freight from Albuquerque to Amarillo. The highway was deserted, just me and the long stretch of asphalt illuminated by my headlights. The moon was a mere sliver in the sky, offering little light to the surrounding desert. Around midnight, as I approached a lonely stretch of Route 66, I saw her, a young woman standing by the side of the road, her thumb outstretched. She wore a simple white dress that fluttered in the wind, and her long hair obscured her face. Now, every seasoned trucker knows picking up hitchhikers isn't the best idea, but something about her seemed off. Maybe it was the isolation of the road or just my own fatigue playing tricks on me, but before I knew it, I'd pulled over. "Need a lift?" I called out. She nodded silently and climbed into the passenger seat. As she settled in, I noticed her skin was cold to the touch, and a faint scent of lavender filled the cab. "Where you headed?" I asked, trying to break the ice. "Just down the road," she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. We drove in silence for a few miles. She stared straight ahead, never once turning to look at me. The air grew colder, and a fog began to roll in, unusual for this part of the country. "Are you from around here?" I ventured. "Not anymore," she said, almost to herself. Suddenly, she pointed ahead. "Turn here." I looked to where she was pointing, a narrow, unmarked dirt road that I was certain hadn't been there before. "Are you sure? That doesn't look like it's meant for trucks." "Please," she insisted, her eyes finally meeting mine. They were a deep shade of blue, almost unnatural. Against my better judgment, I made the turn. The road was rough and the overhanging branches scraped against the sides of my rig. After what felt like an eternity, we arrived at an old, dilapidated house. It looked abandoned, windows boarded up and paint peeling. "This is it," she said, opening the door and stepping out. Before I could say anything, she walked toward the house and disappeared through the front door. I sat there for a moment, unsettled. Something wasn't right. I decided to follow her, if only to ensure she was safe. Leaving the engine running, I approached the house. The door was ajar. "Hello?" I called out. No response. I stepped inside. The interior was covered in dust, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. Furniture lay strewn about and the wallpaper was peeling. On a mantel above a cold fireplace stood a collection of old photographs. I picked one up. A family portrait featuring the young woman, smiling brightly between what appeared to be her parents. But something caught my eye. The photo was dated October 31st, 1958. A chill ran down my spine. That was over 60 years ago. Just then, a whisper echoed through the room. "Thank you for bringing me home." I spun around, but no one was there. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist. Heart pounding, I rushed out of the house and back to my truck. I jumped into the cab and slammed the door shut. Putting the pedal to the floor, I retraced the path back to the main road. As I sped away, the fog lifted, and the temperature returned to normal. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a split second, I thought I saw her standing in the middle of the road watching me leave. I didn't stop until I reached Amarillo. I tried to make sense of what happened, but every explanation seemed more absurd than the last. I asked some locals about the old house along Route 66. One old-timer looked at me, eyes wide. "That house burned down decades ago," he said. "Rumor has it a family died there on Halloween night. Folks say the daughter still tries to find her way home. I don't know what I believe anymore. All I know is that ever since that night I avoid lonely roads and never pick up hitchhikers. Some things are better left alone on the open road." This story gives me chills even though it's been years. It was a late summer night, somewhere along Interstate 70, deep in the Colorado Rockies. That stretch of road gets lonely real quick once you're out in the wilderness. Just miles and miles of mountain pass, trees, and darkness. I'd been driving since dawn, making my way eastbound with a load of electronics, my eyes burning from the long haul. But I knew better than to stop. Not out there. Not at night. Around 2 a.m., the road was practically deserted, just me and the mountains. The only light came from my high beams cutting through the fog that had started to roll in thick off the peaks. There's this spot, drivers talk about it sometimes, right before you hit Eisenhower Tunnel. It's a rough stretch of road, tight turns, steep drops, and if you don't know how to handle it, you'll be part of the mountain before you know it. That's when I saw the lights up ahead. At first I thought it was just another trucker or maybe some poor soul who'd blown a tire. The lights were dim, flickering, like a busted taillight. As I got closer, though, I realized they weren't normal taillights. They were duller, almost like lanterns swaying in the fog just ahead of me, bobbing up and down like someone was walking along the road. I slowed the rig down a bit. There's a lot of wildlife out there, elk or even a lost hiker, but these lights didn't move like anything I'd ever seen before. It was like they wanted me to follow them. I'm not superstitious by nature, but something about those lights gave me the creeps. Against my better judgment, I eased off the gas and kept a cautious eye on the lights as they seemed to drift off the road, down an old service path. The fog was thicker now, so thick my headlights were barely cutting through it. I couldn't see where the path went, just that those lights kept bobbing and swaying, luring me deeper. Then I saw it, the figure. At first, it was just a dark shape in the mist, like a shadow. But as I got closer, it started taking shape. A person standing by the edge of the road, their back to me. No flashlight, no car, just standing there in the middle of nowhere. I pulled up alongside, my rig idling loud in the silence. I rolled down the window and yelled, "Hey, you need some help?" The figure didn't move, just stood there, still as a statue. I felt this cold draft seep into the cab, colder than the night air should have been. My breath fogged up the window as I stared at the person. They were dressed in something old-fashioned, like clothes you'd see in pictures from the 1800s. A long, heavy coat with a wide-brimmed hat pulled down low. "Hey!" I called again, louder this time. Still no movement. That's when the figure turned, slowly, almost mechanically. And when they did, my blood went cold. The face, or what should have been a face, was just wrong, hollow, sunken. The skin was stretched tight, leathery, with eyes that looked like they'd been gone a long time. It was like looking at a corpse, only this one was standing right in front of me. I slammed the window up and floored it. The truck groaned as it lurched forward, tires spinning on the wet road. My heart was pounding, every instinct telling me to get the hell out of there. I didn't look back, couldn't bring myself to. But the worst part? As I was pulling away, I caught something in my side mirror. Those lights, those damn lights, they were following me. They didn't belong to any car or any person. They were just floating there, bobbing and swaying like they had a mind of their own. I kept my foot on the gas until I reached the mouth of the Eisenhower Tunnel. Soon as I hit the other side, the fog was gone. The road was clear. Just like that. No lights, no figure, just the empty stretch of highway in my rear view. I didn't stop until I hit a truck stop in Denver, hands shaking as I tried to light a cigarette. Inside, I found a couple of old-timers sitting at the counter, sipping coffee, and I figured maybe they'd heard something about that road. "You boys ever see anything strange coming out of the mountains?" I asked, trying to sound casual. One of them looked up from his cup, gave me a long look. "You saw the lights, didn't you?" I nodded, not saying a word. He took a drag of his cigarette, real slow-like, then said, "Folks say those lights come from old miners who got lost in the mountains way back when. They'd hang lanterns to guide the others, but some never made it back. Been haunting those passes ever since." I didn't say another word, just finished my coffee and headed back to my rig. I haven't taken that route at night since, and I never will. This story is one that has been passed around between us truck drivers for years. It's about a family who took a road trip they never should have. The family, a husband, wife, and their 2 kids, a boy about 10 and a little girl maybe 5, decided to take a summer road trip through the Southwest. You know the kind of trip. Hot sun, long highways, flat desert for miles. They were heading toward Arizona, planning to stop at some national parks along the way, show the kids the Grand Canyon, that sort of thing. They had an SUV packed up with snacks, clothes, camping gear, the whole 9 yards. The dad was behind the wheel, driving a long stretch of highway that cut straight through the desert. The kind of road that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. Around dusk, they decided to stop for the night, but they couldn't find any towns nearby. Just one of those old gas stations out in the middle of nowhere, the kind with faded signs and a busted-up pump that looks like it hadn't worked in years. The dad figured they'd top off on gas and ask for directions to the nearest motel or camping spot. When they pulled in, the place seemed deserted. No cars, no lights, just the faint squeak of a rusty old sign swaying in the wind. The dad got out and tried the pump, but it was bone dry. He walked up to the station's door and knocked, looking for an attendant, but no one came. The windows were so dusty he couldn't see inside. The kids were restless and the mom was starting to get uneasy, so the dad decided to head back to the car and keep driving. That's when a man stepped out from behind the building. He was tall, dressed in a faded uniform like he was some kind of attendant, but something about him wasn't right. His face looked wrong, too pale, too thin, like he hadn't seen the sun in years. "Y'all need some gas?" the man asked, his voice raspy, like he hadn't spoken in a long time. He had this weird grin on his face that made the dad's stomach twist. The dad, feeling the weight of his family's eyes on him, nodded. "Yeah, we're running low. Know where we can fill up?" The man didn't answer right away, just kept smiling, his eyes shifting to the kids in the back seat. "I got something that'll get you where you need to go," he said, motioning for the dad to follow him around the side of the station. Now, the dad wasn't one to spook easy, but something about this guy put him on edge. Still, he didn't want to freak out his wife or kids, so he followed the man around the corner. There was an old beat-up tank hidden behind the station, but instead of gas, it reeked of something else, like chemicals or rotten eggs. "This'll do the trick," the man said, his grin never fading. "But I gotta warn you, the road ahead, it's got a mind of its own." The dad tried to laugh it off, but his instincts were screaming at him to get out of there. He thanked the man, politely declined the strange gas, and hurried back to the car. They drove off as fast as they could, with the man just standing there watching them disappear into the night. That's when things got real strange. About an hour later, they found themselves on a stretch of road that didn't seem right. The sky was too dark, the stars too far away, and the desert around them felt wrong. The dad glanced at the GPS, but it was glitching out, showing they were driving in circles even though the road stretched straight ahead. The kids were in the back quietly whispering to each other, which wasn't normal. The boy, who'd been talking nonstop the whole trip, was suddenly quiet. The little girl was the first one to speak. "Who's the man in the back seat?" she asked, her voice small, innocent. The dad's blood ran cold. He glanced in the rearview mirror but didn't see anything, just the kids sitting there. "What are you talking about, sweetheart?" the mom asked, turning around to look. The little girl pointed. "He's sitting right next to Joey," she said, eyes wide. "He's smiling at me." The dad gripped the steering wheel tighter, heart pounding. "No one's there, sweetie," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. But the boy, Joey, suddenly looked pale as a ghost and whispered, "He's been with us since the gas station, Dad." Panic surged through the dad. He pressed the gas pedal down, hard, as if speeding up could shake whatever was following them. But no matter how fast he went, the road stretched on, the darkness closing in tighter, and the air inside the car started feeling heavy, thick, like they were suffocating. The mom started to panic, turning to her husband. "What's happening? We need to get off this road." But there was no turnoff, just the same endless strip of asphalt and that overwhelming feeling that they weren't alone. The dad, sweating bullets, tried the radio, but it was all static. His phone had no signal. It was like they'd driven into a place that wasn't on any map. Then the lights ahead appeared. At first they thought it was a town, but as they got closer, they realized it was the same gas station, the same squeaking sign, the same broken-down pump, and the same shadowy figure standing out front. Only this time, there was no grin. The man was just standing there, watching, like he'd been waiting for them all along. The dad didn't stop. He sped right past, eyes locked on the road, but the man's figure didn't fade in the distance. It was like the road had looped, like they were trapped. The little girl whispered again, voice trembling, "He's getting closer." That was it. The dad jerked the wheel, pulling them off the road and into the desert. The SUV bounced and jolted, the headlights cutting through the dust as they veered off the highway. The wife screamed, the kids cried, but the dad kept driving until they were far enough from the road that the lights of the gas station vanished behind them. The car finally stopped, and they sat there, hearts pounding, not saying a word, just listening to the wind howl through the empty desert. They spent the rest of the night in the car, huddled together, too afraid to move. When the sun finally rose, they found their way back to the highway. Everything looked normal again, bright, familiar, the way it should have been all along. They didn't talk much about what happened after that. They made it to the Grand Canyon, but the excitement was gone. They just wanted to go home. But the strangest part? When they pulled into their driveway, Joey, the boy, found something on the back seat. A piece of paper, old and yellowed, with one word scribbled on it in faded ink. "Welcome." The dad crumpled it up and threw it away. But every now and then he'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain that someone was still watching him. something that had followed them back from that long, dark road, and he never took his family on a road trip again. It was the summer of 2015, and my friends and I had planned a road trip through the Pacific Northwest. We were 4 in total: me, Dave, his girlfriend Kelly, and our buddy Josh. Our destination was a cabin in the middle of the Washington woods, where we'd spend a long weekend away from the stress of life. We'd been driving for hours, blasting music and joking around, the dense forest on either side of the road swallowing us as we wound our way deeper into the wilderness. The sun was beginning to set, and we hadn't seen another car in at least 45 minutes. It felt like we were completely alone on this narrow stretch of highway. Dave was driving, and I was riding shotgun. Josh and Kelly were in the back, dozing off. It was peaceful. The orange light from the sunset gave everything a dreamlike quality as the trees blurred past us. That's when we saw it. Out of nowhere, a figure appeared at the side of the road. At first, it was just a shadow in the trees, but as we got closer, it became clear that it was a man. He was wearing a dark, old-fashioned coat, his back hunched, and he seemed to be dragging one leg as he slowly moved forward. "Should we stop?" Dave asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. I didn't like the idea. Something about this man was off. "No," I said, maybe a little too quickly. "He looks weird. Let's just keep going." Dave nodded, and we drove past. As we passed, I glanced out the window, and for a split second, I locked eyes with the man. His face was pale, almost white, and his eyes were sunken into his skull like he hadn't slept in days. He wasn't looking at the road, but directly into the car, directly at me. A shiver ran down my spine, but I shook it off. Just some old guy wandering the woods, I told myself. That's when the GPS cut out. At first, it was just static. The screen on Dave's phone froze, the map flickering in and out. "Great," he muttered. "We're in the middle of nowhere, and now this thing decides to stop working." Josh and Kelly woke up as we slowed down, the eerie silence of the dead GPS and the road stretching out in front of us. "What's going on?" Josh asked, yawning. "GPS is dead," Dave replied. "We might be lost." We tried resetting the phone, but it was no use. No signal, no map. Just trees on either side and the road disappearing into the growing darkness ahead. "Maybe we should turn around," Kelly suggested. "We haven't passed any other roads for a while. If we backtrack, maybe we'll find a sign or something." It was a good idea, but as we looked for a place to turn around, the road began to narrow. The trees were closing in, their branches hanging over us like skeletal fingers. Dave drove slower now, and we all started to feel the weight of the isolation, and then we saw him again. The same man. He was standing on the side of the road, motionless this time, just staring at the car as we approached. It didn't make sense. We had been driving straight for miles, never turning, never passing any side roads. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of us. "Is that the same guy?" Josh whispered, his voice trembling. "It can't be," Dave replied, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. Kelly leaned forward, her eyes wide. "He's staring right at us. Why is he staring?" We drove past him in silence, none of us saying a word as the man's eyes followed the car. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my palms were slick with sweat. I could feel something wrong, hanging in the air. The road twisted ahead, and soon the figure was out of sight. But the tension in the car was palpable. No one spoke. I think we were all trying to make sense of what we'd just seen, and then the headlights flickered. "Not now," Dave groaned, gripping the steering wheel tighter as the lights dimmed, then came back to life. "Come on, not now." The car lurched as the engine sputtered. "Are you kidding me?" Josh muttered. "We just got this thing serviced." The car slowed, and despite Dave's best efforts, it eventually rolled to a complete stop in the middle of the road. The engine died, and the lights went out, plunging us into total darkness. For a moment, none of us moved. The only sound was the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. Then Kelly whispered, "He's out there, isn't he?" I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know if she was right. But against my better judgment, I turned my head toward the window. And there he was. Standing just at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the fading light, was the man. His face was still, his eyes locked on us, watching. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as his pale face seemed to glow in the moonlight, his figure swaying ever so slightly, like he was waiting for something. "We need to go," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "We're stuck," Dave said, his voice shaking as he fumbled with the keys, trying to restart the car. But the engine wouldn't turn over. Josh reached for his phone. "I'm calling someone," he said, but when he looked at the screen, his face went pale. No service. We were trapped. For what felt like an eternity, we sat in silence, hoping the man would disappear, that this was just some sort of weird hallucination brought on by the stress of the trip. But he didn't move. He just stood there, staring, as if he was waiting for us to make the first move. Finally, the car sputtered back to life. Dave hit the gas and we sped off into the night, none of us daring to look back. We drove for what felt like hours before we finally reached a small town. We stopped at a gas station, and when we asked the attendant about the road, he gave us a strange look. "That road?" he asked, scratching his chin. "No one's supposed to drive down there. It's been closed for years." We never spoke about it after that. We never told anyone what we saw. But I still think about that man sometimes, standing at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. And I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't driven away. It was the summer after my freshman year of college, and a couple of friends and I had decided to drive across the country for one of those classic road trips you always dream about. There were 3 of us, me, my best friend Adam, and his cousin Jake. We planned to travel from Chicago to Los Angeles, taking the long, scenic route through the Midwest, the Rockies, and eventually, the deserts of the Southwest. Everything was going great, until we hit New Mexico. It was the 3rd night of the trip, and we had just crossed into the state. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, and we were driving on a lonely stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever, winding through barren, desert landscape. There were no streetlights, no signs, not even another car in sight. Just darkness on either side of the road, punctuated by the occasional shadow of a cactus or rock formation. It was Adam's turn to drive, and I was in the passenger seat while Jake slept in the back. We'd been cruising for a while, the hum of the car's engine and the static of the radio lulling us into a drowsy silence. The only real light came from the moon, which cast long, eerie shadows on the road. I was half dozing, trying to keep my eyes open, when I noticed something in the distance. At first it was just a speck, a faint silhouette barely distinguishable against the darkness of the desert. But as we got closer, the shape grew clearer. A person, standing on the side of the road, holding out a thumb. "Is that a hitchhiker?" I asked, rubbing my eyes to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Adam squinted, leaning forward over the steering wheel. "Yeah, looks like it. Weird place to be hitchhiking, though." It was weird. There hadn't been a town, gas station, or even a rest stop for miles. Whoever this person was, they were stranded in the middle of nowhere, miles away from any sign of civilization. "Should we stop?" Adam asked, glancing at me for reassurance. I hesitated. I mean, what kind of person hitchhikes on a desolate highway like this? Something about it just didn't feel right. "I don't know, man," I replied, my gut telling me we should keep driving. "What if it's like a setup? Someone trying to rob us or something?" Adam laughed, though there was a nervous edge to it. "Come on, this isn't a horror movie. It's just some guy who needs help. We'll give him a ride to the next town." I wasn't convinced, but Adam was already slowing down, pulling the car to a stop about 20 feet in front of the figure. As we came to a halt, the person stepped into the glow of the headlights, and I got my first good look at him. He was tall. Too tall, almost. Lanky, with long, thin arms that hung awkwardly at his sides. His clothes were dusty and ragged, like he'd been walking for days. But it was his face that really unsettled me. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but there was something off about it. His eyes seemed too large, his skin too pale, almost waxy. He didn't blink. He didn't smile. He just stood there, staring at us. Adam rolled down his window, and the man stepped closer, leaning down so that his face was level with ours. "Need a ride?" Adam asked, his voice suddenly much quieter than before. The man didn't answer right away. He just stared at Adam, his large, dark eyes reflecting the headlights in an unsettling way. When he finally spoke, his voice was raspy, like he hadn't used it in a long time. "Where are you headed?" His question hung in the air for a moment. Adam shifted in his seat. We're heading west, toward Arizona. We can drop you off at the next town if you want." The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering this. Then he nodded, slowly, and without another word, opened the back door and slid into the seat beside Jake, who was still asleep. A shiver ran down my spine as I glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the man settle into the back seat. He sat stiffly, barely moving, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Adam glanced at me, raising his eyebrows as if to say, "See? No big deal." But I wasn't so sure. There was something wrong about this guy, something unnatural. We drove in silence for a while, the tension in the car thick enough to cut with a knife. I kept sneaking glances at the hitchhiker in the rearview mirror, but he never moved. Not a single twitch, not a shift in his seat. Just those eyes, staring straight ahead. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Adam spoke up. "So, where are you from?" he asked, trying to break the silence. The man didn't respond. Adam cleared his throat, glancing at me uncomfortably before trying again. "You out here traveling? Or just—" "I'm looking for someone," the man interrupted, his voice low and monotone. Jake stirred in the back seat, waking up. He blinked, groggy and confused, then turned to look at the stranger beside him. "Oh, hey," Jake mumbled, clearly disoriented. "Who's this?" The hitchhiker turned his head slowly to face Jake, his eyes locking onto him with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "I'm looking for someone," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone who doesn't want to be found." Jake's eyes widened, and he shot me a look that said, "What the hell?" I could see the unease in his face now. He wasn't the only one. Every instinct in my body was screaming that we needed to get this guy out of the car. "We're almost to a town," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. "We'll drop you off there." The man didn't respond. He just turned his gaze back to the road, his face expressionless. We kept driving, the minutes dragging on like hours. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands gripping the edge of my seat. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Then out of nowhere, the hitchhiker spoke again. "You should stop the car," he said, his voice calm and deliberate. Adam glanced at me, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "What?" "You should stop," the man repeated, his eyes gleaming in the dark. "Now." Before I could react, Jake leaned forward and whispered, "Dude, don't stop. Just keep driving." But the man heard him. His head snapped toward Jake, his eyes wide and unblinking. I said, "Stop." Adam slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt in the middle of the empty highway. My heart was racing now, adrenaline coursing through my veins as I turned to look at the hitchhiker. He was already opening the door, stepping out of the car with that same unnatural stillness. For a moment, he stood there, staring at us through the open door, his face illuminated by the moonlight. And then he smiled. It was a slow, deliberate smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. And just as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and walked into the darkness, disappearing into the desert without another word. We didn't wait to see where he went. Adam floored it, the tires screeching as we sped down the highway, putting as much distance between us and that man as possible. None of us spoke for a long time, the fear still clinging to the air like a thick fog. Eventually, we reached a small town, pulling into a gas station just as the sun was starting to rise. As we filled up the tank, the attendant came out, an old man with a weathered face and a slow drawl. "Y'all look like you've seen a ghost," he said, chuckling softly. I glanced at Adam and Jake, then back at the old man. We picked up a hitchhiker a few miles back, dropped him off in the middle of nowhere. The attendant's smile faded. His eyes narrowed and he took a step closer. "Hitchhiker?" he asked, his voice serious now. "Yeah," Adam said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Some guy on the side of the road. Creeped us out, so we let him off." The old man stared at us for a moment, then shook his head slowly. "Son," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "there ain't been anyone living out there for 50 years. None of us said a word as we got back in the car. We didn't have to. We knew what we had seen, and we never spoke about it again."